Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we bring you episode number 51, the first of season 2, 12 Angry Men. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. So I have been promising you for a few weeks now that we are going to update the website. That has been done. There are dedicated pages to the podcast itself, and each article that has been featured every week with all of the movies that we've done up to this point are there, as well as our character list from last week, and the general overall list is pinned to the top. So if you click on that in the show notes, so if you go to the episode page, there's an individual link for this particular episode as well as the master list. Those will take you directly onto the website. Part of the reason I don't share the domain name just generally is because it's kind of a complicated one yet, because we're still doing this on the cheap. So, exactly, Dad. So, but there is a subscribe button on the bottom of each page, so you can become a member of the website. That'll also give us your information to sign up for our newsletter, which still goes out with each episode, and I do add some additional pieces to that. On another note, I did just publish my What I've Been Watching Lately article that I do every month currently. The one for January is up, and there will be a dedicated page to that as well as the fact that I will have a separate movie reviews category on my personal blog. There is a page for the other show, The Dynasty Download, which is ending its first season, Super Bowl 55 being around the corner. This one will come out after the Super Bowl is over, so if you already know what happened, please do not disclose that. Obviously, I'm kidding, but anyway. So, Dad, this has been kind of an interesting journey. We're at the precipice of season 2 here. We've done a couple of episodes. We haven't done our 51st movie yet, but this happens to be one of my probably top 10 favorite movies of all time. I don't know what it is for you, but you introduced me to this movie way, way back. What kind of place does it hold for you?
Well, it's one of my favorite movies as well. I don't know where I would rank it as far as movies, because I have a ton of different movies that I like, but for different reasons. Being a lawyer and having done trial work for a number of years, this has always been the one that I thought I would love to have a jury actually behave like this. I just have a sneaking feeling that this is not how juries really are. I think that the juries tend to be more like the jury in this movie was at the beginning than as they were towards the middle and end.
Justice Sotomayor, whether you agree with her particular judicial perspective, maybe that's the best way of putting it, or not, that being aside, was particularly inspired by this movie, has made mention of it multiple times. However, she also, I think, having been in the legal academic field for a while, has said that she has shown this in classes of hers as a case of what not to do as a jury, in fact. That they base a lot of their assumptions on circumstantial evidence and not on actual fact. So there are a lot of nitpicks as far as the legal community, particularly those from the prosecution and the judicial side, that take a rather opposing viewpoint to this movie. So I do want to add that particular thing. But for me, this has always been a special, if that's the right word for it. This one, I think I've seen this at least once a year for probably 20 plus years. And there are only a handful of movies that I can say that of. Once I found out this was based on a play, and that the class ahead of me when I was a freshman in high school had performed it the year before, when I went to a different school the year after, so my sophomore year of high school. I literally begged every drama teacher I had through college to try and do this particular role, this play, and that I would play the Fonda character. For whatever it's worth, this movie has always struck with me. I don't know why I like characters who try and stick up for needless causes, or people that well, I mean, it's the same way you talked to me about why you loved Rio Bravo as a kid. You know, the guy who is completely counted out, that is basically by himself against the bigger, badder conglomerate, if you will. I think there's
well-financed.
Sure. I think this is an intellectual version of Die Hard. And why I say it's an intellectual version is that he slowly has to persuade 11 other people to his side in roughly 90 minutes, and is successfully able to do so over the course of the movie. There's just something that sticks with me. I think of this as heroic. I think all of the notes are struck well. I think it was cast extremely well. This, other than maybe Fonda, there aren't really any other leading actors yet. Well, maybe with the exception of maybe Klugman, but there were a ton of just great actors that were good at playing characters. This was one that I've been looking forward to doing for a very long time, and it holds a special place for me. So, again, I know I told everybody this was on YouTube, and we had some issues with trying to find this. My guess is that right around when the month turned, because it just turned from January to February, that it went, or the rights to it went off of YouTube, and now they're only available on, I guess, this free streamer called Tubi. We're going to call it Tubby, because I think it's funnier. So anyway, so
I did get word from somebody who follows the show that they did see the movie on Tubby or Tubi, whatever, recently, so they were able to get it.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to know that we at least have listeners that are paying attention that well and giving some direct feedback in that way. So appreciate it on that end. Before we get too much farther, there are two particular things that I want to bring up. And I just did this on my other show, also part of the Ronnie Duncan Studio Network. I think that a lot of my focus in the building of these shows has been to build them where they have distinct sections and personalities, and I haven't allowed a lot of space for either of my co-hosts. So, with that in mind, we are building in, and I'm going to make a request as well as something that you are aware of. But, so we're going to start having an in memoriam section, as we've had a lot of recent celebrity or at least movie character actors' deaths. And we have several on the list this week. Because that has always been a favorite portion of the show for you, or of the Oscars for you, I think that's a great area where you can commemorate or memorialize these people. But the other thing I'd like to do, and part of this is just a dissatisfaction. So I know we lead off most of these movie reviews with a summary or a basic plot summary. And really, up until this point, it's been, I'm going to Google the movie name with plot summary after it, and then what comes up, I'm just going to cut and paste, and that's what we're going to use. And half the time, it's pretty good. Half the time, it's not even a really good summary. So, I'm going to challenge you, and I think this is one area that we can carve out that's kind of your own. I would like to see if you can come up or summarize the movie.
So I'm supposed to just do this off the cuff with no preparation?
No.
Or no thought?
For this one, I would have given this to you specifically ahead of time had I wanted you to do it for this movie. I do have one prepared. But going forward, I'm trying to challenge you to come up with the summary that will be a part of the webpage and the rest of it. And, the summary will be your particular area of expertise. I'll do the recognition like I normally do, but...
All right, I can try that. But then again, I think I could probably do the summary right now. The summary is 12 men sworn to a jury go into a jury box or into a jury room, and one person holds out for acquittal or for at least discussing the jury and persuades the other 11 through just his own persistence and his review of the evidence to question the verdict and to question the guilt of the defendant. It's a story of one man against all odds, changing the course of someone else's life.
There you go.
each one of the 12 people comes into that room with their own preconceived notions, their own stereotypes, their own prejudices, and has to assess and judge evidence, because ultimately that's the problem you have when you put a group of people together. You're at the behest of whatever the individual people have in their histories, their past, their perspectives, that's going to alter how they perceive the events that took place during the trial.
So the summary I pulled off the internet: following the closing arguments in a murder trial, the 12 members of the jury must deliberate, with a guilty verdict meaning death for the accused, an inner-city teen, as the dozen men tried to reach a unanimous decision while sequestered in a room. One juror, Henry Fonda, cast considerable doubt on elements of the case. Personal issues soon rise to the surface, and conflict threatens to derail the delicate process that will decide one boy's fate. So not all that different from yours. But the recognition portion of things, just so that we kind of keep moored in, and it's been a while since we've done a movie, so this was nominated for Best Picture, Director, and Adapted Screenplay. It did eventually lose out to another movie we've already done. I think it's episode 37, The Bridge on the River Kwai. This was a 2007 National Film Registry inductee. The American Film Institute has named juror number 8, played by Henry Fonda, 28th in a list of the 50 greatest heroes of the 20th century. They also named 12 Angry Men the 42nd most inspiring film, the 88th most heart-pounding film, and the 87th best film of the past 100 years in 2007. The film holds 100% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on critic reviews, and the site's consensus reads, Sidney Lumet, feature debut, Sidney Lumet. I've heard it pronounced both ways. So
I've always heard it Sidney Lumet.
Well, first off, it's not Lumet. It's either Sidney Lumet or it's Sidney Lumet.
Okay.
I think the emphasis is just slightly different. But anyway, Sidney Lumet's feature debut is a superbly written, dramatically effective courtroom thriller that rightfully stands as a modern classic. It also made the AFI's top 10 of 10 as the number 2 courtroom drama behind To Kill a Mockingbird, which we have not yet done. Personally, I think this is probably a better film. So you've kind of, in your summary, already given what is this movie about. I'm going to take a stab at it and let me know what you think. What is the bigger injustice, convicting an innocent person or setting free a guilty person? Also, what we wished every jury was like if we were on trial for our lives.
Okay. And quite frankly, I know that the general public is going to say that the former, letting a guilty person go free, is going to be the worst thing, but it is not. That's not the preconceived notion. That's not how the American jurisprudence system was established. It was established with a unanimous verdict in a criminal complaint and all the rights that the defendant has to ensure that no innocent person is convicted. And to that extent, each person in there has to do their job. And they talked a lot about what the defense attorney did and didn't do. And I mean, I've probably mentioned this multiple times, but for the first 17 years of my professional career, I did criminal defense work. I had probably 120 criminal jury trials. And, you know, part of your job as a defense attorney is to try to find holes in the evidence, the way the jury was going through and trying to develop or find holes in the various testimony inconsistencies. You shouldn't have to let the jury do that. That should be the defense's job. It's what the state can prove, what the defense can prove, and what really happened. And they don't match.
And this movie really never makes a assumption. I think it leads you down the path of acquittal due to the jury's convictions by the end of it to dismiss, as opposed to if this was really based on a true court case, because then you could see maybe that a few other items would matter more. So like if evidence was handled improperly or there were some other flaws that certainly don't come up in this case, but ultimately it doesn't make a assumption on the guilt or innocence of the boy on trial, who also remains nameless throughout this entire endeavor. And I kept thinking of this while watching it this time. This, to me, this movie is to jury trials what The West Wing is to presidential politics.
Okay. One of the things that struck me is, and I've probably watched this 15, 20 times. I never noticed it until I was paying special attention at the very beginning of the film. As the judge is giving the jury instructions, he looks so incredibly bored and absolutely disinterested in what's going to happen in this murder trial that I don't know how a jury could have done anything but also been as equally disinterested and bored by the jury process or by the verdict as they started to be when this movie began.
Well, and from having sat a few different times in court with you, that to me was the most realistic portrayal of anything in a court system, is a judge who seems generally disinterested and is just kind of going through the motions. I mean, that's not what we'd like to think from a law and order point of view well after the fact, where we seem to take every beat of these like there's going to be a musical cue immediately following some big point or some big speech that happens. But unfortunately, that tends to be the case more often than not, is that we just have a bunch of people going through the motions.
Well, I can honestly say that of the jury trials I've been involved, I have not seen judges behave in that manner very often. There have been a couple of times.
All right, so maybe my perspective is a little bit off on that one, but I don't know. It's not the portions. The 2.5 minutes at the end and the, I don't know, minute and a half in the beginning are not the main portion of this movie. The whole thing, more or less, the stage play and the movie itself, probably 98% of it happens inside the jury room. And that's the point, is that the jury seems more interested than the judge, than any of the lawyers, than anything else, because everybody's assumed a certain level of guilt. And that ultimately this movie is supposed to be about innocent until proven guilty, and one person left to fight for that, let's say, lost cause. Because, I mean, we talk about the reverse aspect in the jury of public opinion. Often we rush to guilt before proven innocence.
Agreed. I think that there is a lot of that. But I think the beginning of the film kind of laid out, there have been a lot of instances where I've tried cases that were, I guess the term would be a dog and pony show. You're just there to make it look good because they're entitled to their trial, but you think the case is over before it ever starts.
Sure.
I've had a few of those. I had one where the guy was on videotape shoplifting, but it wasn't him. And if I put him on the stand, he would say that wasn't him.
Let's move forward. Best performer. What do you have down?
Fonda, without a question. I mean, he's the glue of the entire film. Everything revolves around him. Nothing happens without him. It was a vehicle by which he could be insightful, persuasive, brave, heroic, and it all revolves around him.
The more often I've seen him, the more I come to find Fonda to be the 1B to Jimmy Stewart's Everyman.
Well, there's a reason. They were such good friends, and I mean, they were roommates for a while. I mean, they were a lot alike. They're both Americana. They came from the Midwest and went into movies. Fonda gravitated more towards live theater because he loved the interaction of the audience with his performance.
Fonda has a easy quality about him of the everyman that is similar to Stewart. And I think this is the most notable example where you literally could plug in any person into this type of role, metaphorically speaking, and that it would work. My best performer was Sidney Lumet. Lumet had to get together 12 very distinct personalities, and probably about 7 of these all were pretty good character actors, get them together and get together probably some of their best performances of all time. And all while this was the first, like as that mentioned in the AFI report, this was the first feature film he did. Up until this point, he'd only done TV movies. So for the ability to put all of this together, do it in a timely fashion, and create something so classic that is a favorite of mine, I just seemingly respect his job that he took on and how well. It's not that it's when they talk about an athlete who is the best performer and he raises the ability of everybody around him. I think to a certain degree, Lumet's direction and his ability to get great performances out of the actors ended up being part of why this is such a high grade film.
Okay.
So best secondary performer for you.
Boy, this one was tough. I went into it with different thoughts, and I'm just going to work through it because it gives me an opportunity to comment a lot of different thoughts. First of all, Robert Webber had a knack for being slimy, but yet not, being wishy-washy, but not. He was so.
Can I interject for a second here? I thought it was incredibly surprising because he's a guy I've never really given much attention to during the course of this movie. And by you just mentioning that, I do want to point out he is the only one to have changed his vote multiple times during the course of the movie. Everybody else that changes their vote never really swings back and forth. They start at guilty and then they go innocent, or at least not guilty, and then they stay that way. He's the only one that flips back and forth. It's kind of an unusual performance. It's between him and Jack Warden in that regard. So I actually was very surprised to have you put him on the list last week because he's not a guy I've thought a whole lot about from this movie.
Well, Robert Webber, I've admired his work through a number of years because he always had a knack for playing these characters that were a little swarmy, but there was certain endearing qualities about him. He played Dudley Moore's partner in 10. He got really involved he became a stock actor in Blake Edwards films through the 70s and 80s. And I don't know, I just always enjoyed his work and thought he did a nice job. And in this film, again, it's a very subtle point. So I thought about him as the secondary performance. Then I was going, as I'm watching, E.G. Marshall was so perfect. I mean, his character was just the epitome of self-control, right down to the fact that he didn't sweat until he got put in the corner and had to remember what films he went to see. And then he actually did have a bead of sweat that he had to wipe off.
You know, I'm trying to think of the right word for the characteristic of him. I don't know if self-control.
Stoic?
Yeah, but there's something, there's like a hardness to him, almost a resolute, maybe that's the right word I'm looking for, point of view that he's just, I'm convinced until I'm not. And really, once you break down his wall, because his seems like a logical aspect. You know, he's the stockbroker. He's the non-emotional one. He's not the one that's based on prejudice, as, you know, Ed Begley's based on prejudice, although to a certain extent Lee J. Cobb's is as well. And, you know, those are much more emotional people. His was so, maybe self-contained is the right word, but a logical resoluteness in just being convinced of his opinion.
So I thought about him as being just wonderful in this role.
Yep.
And I finally, while I was actually driving into the office where my studio is, was thinking, really the secondary performance is Joseph Sweeney. Because
Damn it. You got to me. He's not my secondary performer, but he is my most charismatic.
Okay. And he just had that knack. But he was a longtime stage actor. He was a stage actor in the 1920s and 30s. He transferred over as he became older into television, playing the parts of older people. And he actually did the TV version of 12 Angry Men in 1953. Yep. And so Lumet had actually directed that as well and then made the movie. He didn't even consider anybody else for that part. He brought Sweeney in to do it.
No, it's like the marriage of somebody to a part, because I think if I look, Joseph Sweeney only has like 5 different things on his IMDb page, like as credits. And this and the TV version are 2 of the 5. So most of his like there's literally nothing he's known for except being in this film. But he's so ridiculously perfect for every piece that he hits, and he comes in. It's almost like a roundaboutness. The fact that he's the first juror to give a chance to number 8's viewpoint. He even mentions that. This gentleman was gambling on our taking a chance on him, and I was willing to give it to him. And he has a certain level of conviction, but courage, but equally, like, you think about the big access points in the movie. The first real vote where Fonda's willing to give in. That's where Joseph Sweeney steps in. You think about the old man and trying to doubt his testimony. That's where Joseph Sweeney steps in and he tries to humanize the old man. Then the final moment where you get that last bit of evidence, he's the one that notices the glasses and the pockmarks on the sides of the nose. And it seems like every big note he's a part of.
Agreed. And he did a very, very good and credible job in doing that. And part of that just comes in the point of wisdom. And at certain points, there's a reason why in a lot of cultures the elderly are held in high esteem, because they have a certain level of wisdom and knowledge that they've collected that we don't really honor or consider very often. In his particular case, he came into it with a perspective. And moreover, he had no preconceived notions. He didn't come into this with anything specific. He was just there. And as a person who's more senior, he doesn't have to prove anything at this point or feel that he's trying to do anything other than the job that he's doing. He's comfortable with where he's at, more or less. It's hard to describe. Sometimes there's a certain element of you just don't need to impress anybody when you reach a certain age.
No, he's so comfortable with himself. And even in knowing the loneliness of the old man when he's coming to describe him, and you can kind of feel some of the pain, even that moment seems somewhat charismatic. That you're just drawn to him. And, whenever he's taking on Ed Begley, because I think he's supposed to be the direct opposite, and because they're the 2 eldest people in the room, but they're supposed to basically play off of each other, where Begley's supposed to be the old, cantankerous, get off my lawn, old white guy. Joseph Sweeney is the sweet, doddering old grandpa that you just love visiting because he's an unassuming man. And so he is charismatic in just being a good-natured, good-hearted person who doesn't really hold anything against anybody.
I mean, think about how he characterizes the witness. He's never going to be quoted by anybody. His opinion's never going to be sought. What he says is never going to be considered or written down.
He's never mattered.
He's never mattered. And, whether it's kind of like the Oscar Wilde line, which is people living quiet lives of desperation, that they want to find meaning in their lives, that they've actually done something of importance. To some extent, That's why a lot of people live so vicariously through their children. Their children are become the legacy that's the only legacy some people feel they have.
Well, I think to a certain extent, if you wanted to get into a larger conversation, they spent so much, or they also equally blame their children for not having that life. That they lived only for the benefit of their children and thus have to live through their children's lives because they provided a better life than they could have ever had. So, but that's a completely separate thing. That we could go on that for a very, very long time, knowing you and I. The thing I wanted to highlight, since you mentioned that particular line, it not only does it humanize, but you can see the relationship or the similarity. You can feel the pain because there's a certain portion of you that's supposed to think Joseph Sweeney not only understands this man, but he is this man. And I think that's a good way of mirroring it. And yet he doesn't harbor the anger that you would think somebody that lonely or that unappreciated would ever or would naturally have.
Okay.
So my best secondary performer shouldn't be a surprise, since I think most people will have listened to our character actor list from last week, but it's Lee J. Cobb. And I honestly think this might be the hardest role to play out of any of them here. You know, we Ed Begley's character, particularly given the nature of politics currently, is a caricature. Like, at that point, you could get anybody to basically play that because it is a caricature. There is a template to playing that character that you know exactly who that is. You probably have somebody in your life, your racist uncle or whomever, that could easily stand in and you have something to work off of. I don't think it's nearly as easy to play the juror number 3 part because there's a seemingly infinite amount of pain and loss simmering under the surface the whole time from that character. And I think he plays similar parts in the On the Waterfront villain as also being somewhat of the, I don't know, antagonist. I wouldn't say villain of this movie, but the antagonist. There is such a complex nature to his guilt. Yes, there's a simple reason for it, and he specifies it in the film without going too much into the background. You know, I had this fight with my son. He took a swing at me. We haven't talked for 2 years. And he, more than anybody else, represents the nature of, as a parent, you live your life for the betterment of your children, ultimately to be undone. And I think he, more than anybody else, and it never comes out, I think it's a subtle thing, puts himself in the place of the murder victim. That he is the self-proclaimed of some variety, or the public avenger that comes up in the middle of this movie because he sees himself avenging the anger and resentment he holds towards his son because of the pain that not being associated with his son. He sees all of his own mistakes. And so, but that's a complex thing because you can still tell that there's a genuine love for his son. I think there's so many layers to that character that it's very difficult to play and play well. And yet, if it's not done completely on the nose, the way that Cobb did it, I don't think this movie works because he is the major antagonist. Ultimately, E.G. Marshall is convinced by a certain portion of the film, the logic of the facts. But you also have to overcome the emotional side of things because people are bringing so much into a jury room from the outside. And all of them represent different parts. But the two most stalwarts, or the three, if you will, Begley, E.G. Marshall, and Lee J. Cobb are all so jurors, I guess it would be 10, 4, and 3, all represent the biggest portions to overcome. Think of it in the same way that a movie like Inside Out had specific characters to represent certain emotions. The same things that ultimately you have to overcome in order to get to a verdict of not guilty in this movie are all represented by specific jurors. And particularly those three. Those are the last three things that you have to overcome. Your preconceived prejudice, your logic, and your emotion. And the emotional one is the last one to fall because that's the toughest one to get away from. All right, so I had my most charismatic. Who goes for you on most charismatic?
Cobb. Simply because whenever he's on screen, he fills the screen. He just has this knack for anytime he says it, even when he's being calm, he just has a knack for drawing your attention. And, whether it's positive or negative, most of the time in the film it's negative. Even when he's trying to be polite, explain his anger, whatever, even there you kind of almost go, you're just a jerk. And, but he always had that knack. Anything he did or whatever, he just seemed to always be a little bigger than life in any scene he did. I mean, there's a reason why he was the original Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman. He started the role. And, I can just imagine him there, and I can imagine the room or the walls of the theater reverberating as he's shouting as Willie Loman. And I just think he's always had that ability. I mean, I found it interesting because when I was doing some research on him, you stop to think about how excited and how vocal and how bombastic he could be. And of course, what did he do? He died of a heart attack.
I mean, in many ways that does make sense. I don't know if it's an interesting way of seeing charismatic. I'll just say that. Normally I associate them almost exclusively with the positivity. So I guess
you're going to tell me that Hitler was not charismatic? That's
I suppose. I mean, that's a good point. Yeah, but well, be it for me to try and argue whether the finer points of the charisma of Adolf Hitler.
Well, or it certainly wasn't the frickin' mustache.
All right, so best scenes. First nominee, I'll go first. I think because it was on the posters, it is the first real dramatic beat of the movie is the second knife.
Okay.
He pulls a secondary knife out of his pocket, sticks it in the table, and everybody reacts. And that's supposed to be the first one that's really the revelation of the movie that, oh, okay, this is, and really Joseph Sweeney switches his vote based solely on that one piece. And even after that, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, they're right. This is an absolute 1,000,000-to-1 opportunity that the exact same knife would be the one used. That this by itself is not a whole lot of evidence, and why would anyone go looking for it? But it is a nice dramatic flair to the movie that it gives you this nice big ignition moment of, oh, okay, all right, I can buy into this guy and why he has some issues with the case.
Let's just put it this way. If it ever came out that he went out and found another knife and brought it to the jury room, it would be grounds to have the jury. So if they would have convicted based on something that a juror brings in as far as outside evidence, that would have been grounds for a new trial.
Oh, yeah. And so I think that feeds to the larger point that I saw from Sotomayor of, they base this stuff on, or the acquittal on a whole lot of stuff that isn't actually involved. I mean, if anything, you have possibly one of the worst defense attorney performances that they didn't do any questioning of this. But ultimately, and this might be one tipping my, bringing this up before I had wanted to, but one of the questions I was left with for a lot of this is a lot of evidence comes up well after the fact and just stuff where they're just rehashing and all of a sudden somebody makes a new point. It's not that Henry Fonda had anything other than a feeling that there was something not right about the case, and that's why he voted for not guilty. Like his true inclination toward that does not seem very strong if you really think about it, because that was the only piece of major evidence that he had that there was something off about the case. Also, what would make him, what would possess him to go do that? It's not like he had some background that says, oh, there got to be a lot of these switchblade knives.
Yeah. I used to tell my clients that if the jury came back quickly, that's a good sign. You know, I've had juries that have gone out. I think my shortest one was 18 minutes. It takes you 15 minutes to use the bathroom and elect the foreman. And usually it's an acquittal, because if it's a guilty verdict, they sit back there, and even if they're chit-chatting, because they don't want to come out too quickly, because it looks like they didn't do their job. So they sit back there and milk it for a while. If they come back that quick, it's usually for an acquittal. And this was one of those situations where I think more than anything, Henry Fonda, he really didn't have a whole lot of points. He hadn't even worked through the evidence. It was all a gut feeling that we need to go through this and be more thorough with the evidence. And as they started going through the evidence, I'm not sure that Henry Fonda even believed he was not guilty. I think he just kept saying, I think we should talk about it. I just have a feeling. Is it possible? It's possible. And working through the evidence, he convinced himself.
Well, and I think that's the part that I find to be the most unbelievable. I mean, you don't think about it in the moment, but when you're able to pick this apart a little bit, and I just don't find his motivations to be as believable as a character the further on you think about this movie.
Well, I don't know. I've thought about it, and I can see a lot of people that are like that. So I guess I don't have as much criticism of it as a character.
All right, so what scene would you like to nominate first?
The eyeglasses scene, the pinch on the nose, because that's really where it just kind of turned. Because at that point, when you can convince E.G. Marshall that that he's not guilty, you can just feel the whole temperature, the scene where he's sitting there and he's pondering it, and you can hear the rain in the background, and it's just a very quiet moment. And you can see him ponder. You can see the wheels turning. And then, what are you, Lee Cobb, what are you trying to say? You're trying to twist the evidence. I saw it. Not guilty.
That is set up because E.G. Marshall's the one trying to broker, okay, when do we call for dinner? Do we have some type of situation? Because he seems so resolute that there's going to be nothing that's going to change his opinion. Every other piece of evidence that most people, the general audience, thinks, oh, I would have questions about that too, and then I would probably change my opinion. He doesn't seem to be swayed by in the slightest. And then all of a sudden, you just have this one moment, and then it's hanging by a string. If you've never watched the film before, you have no idea what's coming. But Joseph Sweeney all of a sudden has this just stroke of brilliance, and he dangles it on a hook. Like, it's not apparent until it's incredibly apparent. Because he does this whole lead-up speech to why or what he noticed. And it makes that moment that much more powerful.
I love the scene for that very reason. It's subtle. That's the key. It would have been real easy for, eureka! It was very subtle. It was underplayed. And as a result of it being underplayed, it had a lot more impact than if it would have been a club.
The only problem I have now in rewatching it, and you know that's like the climactic moment of the movie, and everything's kind of sloping off, is that I'm torn whether that should have been the climactic moment. Because you've got to push Lee J. Cobb just that little bit further, and that was going to be the next one I was going to nominate, is Juror 3, so Lee J. Cobb's character, is pushed to the brink. And he, basically all of them staring at him, what is left for you to deny other than the things that have nothing to do with this case? And basically him going into that monologue of breaking himself down, letting go of all of the things that he brought in. And I think some of that feels undercut because of how that's the scene before it works. And Marshall seems the most, or the one who's the most resolute, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So I guess if I had any complaint, and again, I love this movie, but if I had any complaint, that would be the one thing that I have, is that it ends up making what's supposed to be the emotional moment of the movie kind of seem a bit more superfluous.
Yes, I can understand your point. I think what it was meant to do is to separate logic from prejudice. And ultimately, that's what it came down to. Logic won, and then you're just left with nothing but prejudice. And the prejudice had to be defeated as the last thing. Prejudice is the thing that lasts beyond logic.
Well, and so I guess I'll nominate the quote in advance of that since it's being brought up. But it's always difficult to keep personal prejudice out of a thing like this. And wherever you run into it, prejudice always obscures the truth. I don't really know what the truth is. I don't suppose anybody will ever really know. 9 of us now seem to feel that the defendant is innocent, but we're just gambling on probabilities. We may be wrong. We may be trying to let a guilty man go free. I don't know. Nobody really can. But we have a reasonable doubt, and that's something that's very valuable in our system. No jury can declare a man guilty unless it's sure. We 9 can't understand how you 3 are still so sure. Maybe you can tell us.
Yeah. Well, I have another scene I want to nominate, which is
It is your turn.
The closing scene. The scene where they finally reach the verdict and they go back into the court. And they all get up. And somebody gently helps Ed Begley Sr. up from his chair and kind of helps him compose himself to go back in. And ultimately, Henry Fonda goes over to the closet and gets the jacket and walks over to Lee Cobb and helps him on with the jacket. What that means is we've battled, and now it's time to forgive, forget, and move forward and to reunite. It's kind of like a scene. It's a, what's the term?
It's a metaphorical representation of the logical emotions.
It's cathartic.
Cathartic. Okay.
Cathartic. Excuse me. It's like, okay, we've battled through this. Now it's time for us to go back and be civil and be in the community again and move on beyond this. It's what I used to say. I had some very good friends who were prosecutors that we would just battle back and forth. And, but I always had a knack for knowing that when I walked out of the courtroom, it was done. I could enjoy things. And I've had a lot of people that I work with. I mean, I've been on elected positions where administrators are on, directly answered to me as a member of a board or of a council or whatever. And I can still be friends because they know darn well that if it ever comes to a point where I don't think they're doing their job, I'm going to tell them that. My friendship with them is not going to get in the way of the profession or the business relationship we have. And you'd like to see that, and to some extent that's the way it should be, but there are so many people who hold personal grudges.
Again, I think to a certain extent this is a fantastic representation of the things we'd like our system to be like, or the way that we hoped we would be if we were put in these situations. But I don't think that the reality always meshes with that.
Very seldom does.
That's why I think if you redid this one, again, maybe that's a reason I'm drawn to this film, is that it has a very optimistic, hopeful outlook. And again, it's why I compared it to The West Wing. I think a lot of people are drawn to The West Wing for the, it's not heroic, but
Idealistic?
Idealistic, altruistic nature. I think this is the idealist's version of a jury. And by extension, I've said repeatedly, the thing I look for in movies sometimes is the hero. There's a reason I'm drawn to comic book characters, because they figure out a way to win in the end. You know, the hero always prevails. I'm always drawn to those stories. Yes, I know that they're not necessarily realistic, but in an escapism, I don't always want that to be realistic. Sometimes it's just nice for the good guy to win.
Okay.
Also, the subtlety, and I always notice this, Lee J. Cobb is always depicted darker and in a darker suit. He has his tie off to the side, and Henry Fonda's always got his coat on, and he's always got, I don't know if it's a white suit, but like a very light-colored suit. And you get the very distinct, because those are the two oppositional characters, because they specifically go at each other personally. The black hat and the white hat type of representation. I thought that was incredibly apparent. All right, so another one, I would also say this is the secondary dramatic moment, and they really lead up to it with the musical cue, but that moment, that tension, that beat, when they do the second vote and Fonda abstains, I just think is a good moment, and I think it's a well-directed part of the film, because even for as many times as I've seen this movie, you're still waiting for that beat where everybody votes guilty and the movie's over.
Yes. It was well done.
They do a good job of obscuring it just enough that you think, no matter how many times you've watched it, it's going to go the other way one of these times. Did you have another scene to nominate?
One scene that stuck out to me was the scene with Fonda and Ed Bynes in the bathroom, where he starts talking about, well, you know, maybe he did do it.
Yep.
And it struck me. That's the kind of casual conversation sometimes people have. And I always try to remember. I mean, obviously, I'm well educated. All right, I went to a private college because I had a scholarship. I went to a private law school because that's where I got into. And but I also come from a family where my grandparents were dairy farmers. My parents worked in factories. So I try to keep my roots. There's a lot of wisdom sometimes that can come from guys who are house painters, because they just don't have a lot of, they see things in more black and white than a lot of our intellectuals do. And there's a lot to be said for that. He tells he's just a common laborer,
thinking.
And Fonda is an architect, and you think intellectually. And I think that's what that scene was supposed to show, is the intellectual variation between these two characters. And ultimately, he's the one who cut to the chase and said, hey, maybe he's guilty. And it just came across as being unnatural. He came across many a time in this film as being the one person who wasn't trying to overthink things, who didn't have a lot of prejudices, didn't have a lot of preconceived notions. He was just sitting there listening to stuff and trying to make a rational decision based upon what he saw and thought.
He was much more of a background character than just about anybody else in the movie. He had probably, I think, some of the fewest lines to deliver, and probably represented the least about his upbringing or who he was than just about anybody else on the jury, besides maybe there isn't a lot to say about Bagley's character. You never get what he does or where he's from, really. You just get his loud-mouth prejudice all the time. That's really the only... And that's why I say, I think more than any other character, that one's the caricature. Because I think it's just supposed to fit an archetype. But the bigger thing that I took away from that scene, and I'm glad you did highlight it, and that's where I came up with the question. And I think that is fundamental to how people see the justice system, particularly given the nature of how it's represented in, and I don't want this to be a thing of all the media, because I think that's just lazy. But I do want to specifically say that with shows like, all of the cop shows, the Law and Order, all of those types that are always for the conviction, that are always about trying to get a bad guy type of mentality, that I think we have steered collectively into a decision. And I think you highlighted it somewhat early on when you were answering the question, that I think we collectively think it's a much worse thing for a guilty man to go free than it is for an innocent man to be convicted. Now, you and I take a different tact, but I think we're the sore thumb that sticks out.
Well, there's a reason why we think this. And I know that, you grew up with the law because, I've talked about it. You've worked in my office. You understand it better than most people do. And you come at it from a perspective that permeates. You've decided, though, that that's not the way you want your life to be, but it still affects you because you're a creation of your experiences.
It is the one area that I think I draw on very differently than the general. Okay, so there are two particular intellectual concepts or conceits that I have that I don't think are the popular response. One, I do think government can be used in good collective ways and is ultimately a reflection of the public. Thus, it has to serve the public good. The other thing is that the court system is not, and the American court system, the judicial system, is not for conviction, but rather for defense, so that we avoid the mistakes of wrongful conviction.
And really, DNA evidence has had more benefit for the innocent than it ever has had for the guilty.
Oh, God, yes.
And no, I think to some extent it really annoys some people because how many people have been convicted and sent to prison and then the DNA comes back and there's no way it was them, and now, and I can name one person in particular who still believes the 5 individuals in Central Park should be put in prison even though the DNA did not come back correctly.
I'm not sure who you're thinking of, but if it's somebody you know personally, I don't think this is the place to out them.
No, it's not somebody I know personally.
It's
somebody
a public
that
figure?
I know that's living in Florida now. He used to live
okay.
more central part of the country.
I see.
Somewhere in between Richmond and Baltimore.
Okay, so do you have any other scenes you'd like to nominate?
No, that's fine. There's just so many. We could probably name
I know.
almost every scene in the movie.
I think there are 2 other ones that I'd just like to quickly mention. So, Juror 11 confronting Juror number 7, where you get the watchmaker who comes at this from the foreign, I guess you would say immigrant, but it comes at Jack Warden's character for seemingly his indifference and going with the majority tide, which I guarantee you there's probably one of those, if not multiples, on every jury who just it doesn't care all that much. He's just going through that, and he just wants to be with or vote with whomever the majority is. It's not quite so public, I would guess, when push comes to shove in this manner, but I think there is something to be taught about his conviction of the American system. So often we have a collective, description, but thought of immigrants as not having an appreciation for American ideals. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. I think there's nobody that appreciates American ideals more sometimes than immigrants because they know exactly what it is to not have them. So I think that scene has always stuck out for me.
It's a good scene, and it is a good point because we have an indifference at times. We seem to take things for granted in this country that other countries really long to have. And so, yeah, I can understand your point in making that noted.
I think more than anything else, and I'm somebody who fights constantly against the notion of American exceptionalism, but if you're to talk about anything that makes America exceptional, other than our gross overconfidence about just about everything that we do, it's our idealism. So
yes,
anyway, the only
to some
other one,
extent.
the only other one I wanted to highlight, and this was one I thought about a lot. Basically, in between the dates of November, I think 6th, 2020, until January 20th, 2021, was the basic final Ed Begley scene. You know these people.
Did I see
Be
him
loud,
in the Capitol?
but I think it's a tact that I wonder if it would be actually effective, where you just stop paying attention to people trying to bark that all of these people are despicable. If you stop giving attention, if you stop feeding into the aggrieved nature of a lot of people, particularly as social media is right now, would they seemingly have any fuel? It's a question I'm very curious about.
Anything, whether it's a prejudice or an ideology or something, I have said for years that it's the last vestige of a lazy mind. Because if you just say, I'm a conservative, or I'm a liberal, or I don't like a race, you don't have to think. You just react.
And well, that's more of a labeled identity than it is necessarily a prejudice, but...
No, but what I'm saying is you just automatically, you don't have to think about it. You just react. I make individual judgments on issues. I try to as much as I can because there's nuances. You can't just say if you're a liberal, this is the big thing. This is one of the things I've been commenting about. For example, if you talk to most people who call themselves liberal, they'll go on and on about how important the VA healthcare system is. I've been nuanced for this for years because I've worked with patient or clients through it, and I think they should be abolished because it's inefficient and it's a poor quality of care. They would be better off if we gave all the veterans the equivalent of a Medicaid or a Medicare card and said, go in the private system and do it because they'd have better. When I tell this to certain people who I would consider liberals, I'm criticized for it because how can you say that? The private sector is never better. No, the private sector is better at times. You just have to know which ones it is or which times it is.
All right. So before we go on too much further, because we've been discussing this for quite a long time already. Favorite scene. I'm going to nominate the eyeglasses as my favorite scene. I think it's the climactic moment of the movie. I think it sticks out for me. It's the one where you're like, all right, yeah, now we're running downhill.
I agree. It's the same one I had. I had thought about that going into the film, and then I tried to completely, come at it fresh and think seriously about it. And ultimately, that's the scene where if there's anybody that's a skeptic of the evidence, that's the scene where it just changes.
Yeah. I think it's the one where you can't deny any further, even though effectively, if that didn't come out in the course of things, you don't know for sure whether or not she did wear eyeglasses. Your supposition is that. So I understand the point of view that they're making a lot of assumptions based on some very small pieces of evidence, but it does make for a nice dramatic moment. As far as the most indelible moment, I think it's the second knife, because I think it's the forward trajectory of undercutting the case piece by piece by piece by piece. And I think by far it's the most dramatic thing. It's the thing featured on most of the movie posters at the time is that of a knife. And I think it is the piece where, you ask too many people about the moment that sticks out for them. I think this is at least going to be in the top 5 of those.
Okay. This one I really struggled with to come to terms with.
So clear out your mind, and this is so we'll do this exercise, but ultimately, just think about the movie and the first thing that pops into your head.
The scene with Sweeney and the not guilty vote when he makes the last ditch effort to, the gamble. It just always strikes me where, when you're, even the Lone Ranger had Tonto, and, sometimes you swim against the current and you need that one person who believes in you to allow you to continue the fight against overwhelming odds. And to me, that was that scene where somebody put faith in Henry Fonda's character and what he was trying to do. And ultimately, that's the changing moment as far as how things were being perceived and where things were going. It started a chain reaction that built to the ultimate conclusion.
So let's take a quick break for a sponsor. All right, welcome back. Let's jump into Best Lines. All right, what is your first nominee, Pop?
You know how they all are. And then it's that whole scene then, which follows, where they all one by one stand up and turn their backs on him.
Well, I think you could just leave it at that. But
yeah.
You're talking about a matter of seconds. Nobody can be that accurate. I think testimony that could put a boy in the electric chair should be that accurate. You have another nominee?
No, not off the top of my head. It was hard because the lines were kind of.
I thought it would be much harder than I ended up having in order to put these together. So it's hard to put into words. I just think he's guilty. I thought it was obvious from the word go. Nobody proved otherwise. Nobody has to prove otherwise. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. The defendant doesn't even have to open his mouth. That's in the Constitution. I don't remember that being in the Constitution, that a defendant doesn't have to open his mouth.
Yes, it is. You have a right against self-incrimination.
Well, that's the Bill of Rights.
That's what it means. The defendant doesn't have to take the stand. In fact, most good trial lawyers, criminal defense lawyers, say that they don't want their claimant to ever take the stand, or their defendant.
Yeah, because they don't want to see them picked apart. I beg pardon? I beg pardon. What are you so polite about? For the same reason you are not. It's the way I was brought up.
Okay, you're doing a better job than I am on this.
For whatever reason, that line more than any other time I've seemed to watch this, because I think I watched these movies through a different eye. Like there's a new one that grew out of my forehead doing the show, but for whatever reason, that one stuck out more for me because I think that has a funneling effect. I thought more deeply about that one. I think there is a certain poetry to it that sometimes in your upbringing and your level of decency is just on what you value. And a lot of that has to do with upbringing. I guess if you want to put it that way, that would be the baby boomer way of putting it, I suppose.
I do like the Bynes line, you talk to an old man like that again, I'll lay you out.
All right, so funniest line. Did you have any?
No, I really didn't. It's hard
so I got 3.
Okay, go ahead.
You a Yankee fan? No, Baltimore. Baltimore? That's like being hit in the head with a crowbar once a day.
About that time it was.
Yeah. Had business before with the tall guy. What's his name? Was trying to bait me. That doesn't prove anything. I'm a pretty excitable person. I mean, where does he come off to calling me a public avenger, sadist and everything? Anyone in his right mind would blow his sack. He was just trying to bait me. He did an excellent job. I always laugh at that line. And then finally, just because this is the editor in me, Bright. He's a common ignorant slob. He don't even speak good English. Doesn't even speak good English.
Yeah.
All right. You ready? Season 2 of the Stanley Rubric.
Yes, I am.
Why are you trying to sound like... what is it? I'm not even sure. Low and gravelly.
Well, continue.
Okay. So what did you have down for legacy?
I went with a 9. Simply because this film is, 50 or 60...
63 years old.
63 years old, and it's still as poignant now as it was then.
Oh, I think this could easily be remade, and there's not a whole lot that you'd change.
I think you'd have to change the title, because you'd have to have women involved,
Right.
so you'd have to change the title, but you could easily put it together and do it now.
No, I think... So, who the characters are would be slightly different, save for maybe Ed Begley's character, but I think you could change the diversity of the cast without changing the characters. I think there's a certain timelessness in that particular aspect, but that's saved for classicness. Legacy itself, why do you go on that?
Simply because it's still... Part of what I think for Legacy is if people watch it and it still has some impact on their thought, their understanding of things, yet when they watch it 63 years later. And so I've had comments of people that I've recommended watch this film about how good it really is. And, if it can hold up for 63 years and still make people think about the process of a jury that long after it was made, it's got a legacy.
There are very few courtroom drama type movies of the judicial system that I think have a bigger imprint on movie culture than this. Like, for me, as far as the pantheon of courtroom films, it's this and it's probably A Few Good Men. Like, those are like the two unassailable pantheon movies, and from what I can remember. I'm sure there's probably something else that, like, if you made a top 10 list, obviously there'd be a bunch of them thrown in there. But I don't think there are any quite as meaningful, and I think that's reflected in the fact that this is on how many different countless lists. Like, I don't think there's a top 100 list that doesn't include this in some capacity, because it has that idealism aspect to it. It is included all over the place in common film literature. It's a movie that has maybe not the same impact in the moment, but certainly has a certain legacy to it. I mean, I think this has a name recognition. The only place that I would ding it, if I would say, and this is a difference between, so I think I went with, what was it, a 9.5 when we did Casablanca just because people hadn't seen it. I think this might be one that people probably might have seen more often than Casablanca, because I think this is one that has been shown to high school classes forever. I think this has been shown to college classes whatsoever or forever. This is just something that I think has had a certain livable part of the culture yet that maybe we don't necessarily think of immediately. But you mention this to people, I think it has a notable association, that they've seen it, that they know of it, they know at least the premise of it, that has a certain livableness. And I think it lives in a film critic world as a pantheon film as a result of that. So I actually gave it a 10, which, again, I thought this was a odd one because of the genre in which it stands. I think we have an appreciation for courtroom films. There aren't too many courtroom films that I think people would necessarily place ahead of this. So if you're talking about the Mount Rushmore of courtroom dramas for film, this is on that list. What was your score again? You went with a 9?
9.
So that's going to create a 9.5 for us collectively. All right. So impact significance. This is the one that I probably gave the lowest grade of any of these categories on. And it was a film that kind of went by. It was nominated for awards, but it was not a like box office darling. It didn't seem to have an immediate impact on people. I think this is one where in the moment it was not a big deal. I think as time has gone on, more people have come to appreciate it. And one thing I forgot to mention as part of the legacy is how many times this film has been redone or readapted in multiple different countries. There are at least, I think last I counted, at least a dozen different attempts at doing this movie in other countries, languages, and cultures. So when you have that movie adapted that many times, I think that does add to its legacy score. But before I forgot that one. So I because it was nominated, because I think it starred Henry Fonda, I don't think this went completely unnoticed, but I can't give it an immediate impact. I can't give it the same level. So I went with a 6, and I'm not really confident about that one.
This is not a film that I was aware of when I was young. This isn't one that I watched. This is not one that I talked with my dad, who,
Yeah, that's not surprising. I think he was a man of the moment, and so if he hadn't seen this one, I think this was one that has only come about through like civics teaching over time.
I think later on I had mentioned seeing it and him commenting about it and having, enjoyed the film after the fact, but it wasn't like something, And quite frankly, I'm sure that part of the problem was that it struck close to home because being a Duncan, most of the time
we were in the
defendant.
court system. Yeah. I just got a weird new idea for a segment we could do that I can give you as well. What would your dad review this film?
For that matter, we could do the whole shtick we do about comedies with your mother.
Well, I mean, that's our, Statler and Waldorf moment trying to pick on mom. But I'm thinking more of your dad never said more than 3 words about something. So what is the Ron review on this particular movie? So we do it in 3 words.
Well, let's see. It's kind of good.
I think I watched that.
Yeah.
That's 4, actually. Oh, that might be hard.
So.
All right. I don't think you gave a score. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
I went with a 7.
Okay.
Simply because it's one of those that kind of is out there, but it's not,
I think at the time of this film, if I'm to make a guess, and since I wasn't living at the time, and there aren't a lot of contemporary thoughts on this, which is a little bit surprising, but I think this is the evidence of like one of those. Every year since we've expanded the Best Picture list, there's always like 1 or 2 films that are really, really good but aren't going to win Best Picture and are kind of down the list, and so they get recognized and thrown in there. But as time goes on, those are the ones that become the most appreciated out of the group. I think to a certain degree that was this. Is one that's kind of thrown in. It got some recognition because it was really good, and some of the critics recognized it at the time. But it wasn't necessarily one of those that was heralded as being the film that particular year.
I could agree with that.
So that makes a 6.5 for the 2 of us. Novelty, the whole system, the whole premise of the movie is built around the judicial system, how it works, all of the idealism. There aren't a lot of movies like this. And I also mentioned before, how many other movies are told solely from the perspective of the jury itself? Like, I think every other thing pays an homage to this that is from the jury perspective. I think this is the movie of juries, pure and simple, as far as courtroom. Everything else is done by the prosecutor or the defense attorney or whatever else. There are not really any that don't at least pay or take on a different or perspective than that of 12 Angry Men. If you see something from the jury where it's told from the jury perspective, I think they even pay an homage. So I think this one stands alone by itself. I gave it a 10 for novelty.
I went with 9.5, but I could almost buy your 10. I just hate giving 10s.
I know, and again, I reserve them for certain things, and I think we need to have a wider range of things. That's why I think almost intentionally at some point we need to do a grossly overrated movie to set the bottom end of our scale. So I don't know what that would be necessarily, but all right, let's just go with a 10 collectively then for that.
Okay.
Classicness, I can either go with a 9.5 or I can go with a 10. And I think the only thing that I could give it is the exact the things we mentioned already. That it's 12 Angry Men and that everybody in the cast is seemingly white. With that being said, if you look at the boy who's the defendant, you can obviously tell he is an immigrant or a minority of some variety. He is not, I mean, he is not what you would say is prototypically white, Caucasian, Western European. He looks Italian, if nothing else. And even that at the time was not necessarily like the most favorable group of people in the country. There's a specific immigrant in the group. There's another guy who grew up in the slums. There's a very different array of cast members all over the cast that come from a different set of angles. Jack Warden's character is very different from Henry Fonda's character, is very different from Robert Webber's character. And I think there's, a timelessness that is part of this film, that you could basically reset it, have it be in a modern jury box, although I don't know how you do jury trials right now with Zoom, but that'd be interesting point of view for a film. But
they don't. The courts are putting plexiglass between the seats and spreading the jury out across the room.
I see. Okay. Well, even so, I'm with you. I have a hard time giving 10s, but I really don't see a problem with giving this much of a 10. If anything, it's a nitpick.
The only problem I have is it's back in the 50s, so it is a men's thing. It's right. And I understand that, but that's the only reason I gave it a 9 is because of the lack of diversity. But it's not a criticism, it's a sign of where it was and when it was made, because that's what happened. That's how it was. I'm not even sure women were on juries at that time.
Yeah, and so I understand it's a byproduct of the time. I just think that diversity as a character is not necessarily a prohindrance to this film and its impact. Like in other films, I think it would be good to have a perspective of diversity, but I think that for the most part, there is a certain level of diversity, even though it's a bunch of white men. If that makes sense. I think it's built into how the script was written, and which is why I don't think you need to change much other than the look of the cast without it being basically the same movie. So anyway, that'll carry as a 9.5 collectively, though. So rewatchability, everybody should pretty much know it by this point. I've said how many times that I've at least watched this once a year for probably 20 years. This is a straight 10. I could literally watch this movie almost on a loop.
Yeah. I don't give out 10s very often, but I'll give one on this. You haven't really
given out a 10 for rewatchability.
I'll give this a 10. By the way, I just happened to, I don't know if it was yesterday or Thursday, just needed a break from writing briefs and happened to be skimming through the TV in my office and found the last half hour of A Few Good Men. So yeah. I got the courtroom scene.
Which, when we get to it, I think by far that's the part of the movie that everybody knows and loves. Like, the whole movie serves to be that last half hour.
Yeah, and I had stopped, or I'd forgotten when I was thinking about the film about how Tom Cruise could be court-martialed for besmirching an officer's reputation, and what he was potentially risking by going forward with his line of questioning that he did. So I don't know. It's just a memorable moment, and this is a film that basically I've seen so many times. If I'm flipping through and I see that this is on, I can pick it up 3/4 of the way through and enjoy watching the last portion of it.
I'm completely with you. And I think for the most part, this is one of the higher audience scores I've seen when we've done the list. So they had a 97, so that's 9.7 overall. And so that was 9.5 for legacy, 6.5 for impact significance, 10 for novelty. That was a 9.5 for classicness, a 10 for rewatchability, and 9.7 for audience score for a 55.2, and putting that squarely at number 1.
Wow. Okay.
By a good margin.
By a lawyer and a lawyer's kid. Who'd have thunk?
Okay. Let's pump the brakes here for a second. I mean...
I know. Law, politics.
Somewhat historical idealism.
Yeah. We haven't done Lincoln.
Okay.
Because that's not only historical, it's military history, and it's Lincoln, done by Spielberg.
So anyway, remaining questions, did you have any?
Ultimately, what happened to the kid?
Yeah, they kind of never really tell you, other than, they're going to go acquit him. So, I mean, I guess I've never really thought about it or cared that much, because I think once you get past the point of the acquittal and given the characters and the defendant and that sort of thing, he's just kind of a stand-in. But I don't know. I guess I've never given it that much thought. Is that your only question?
No, I do have a couple others. Why is it juror number 2 sounds so much like Piglet?
Oh, the first time I watched this, you pointed that out.
Yes. So the only this, the Odd Couple, and the Bob Newhart shows. The only time I've ever seen John Fiedler in anything other than doing the voice of Piglet.
Sometimes you don't need to do much more than that.
True.
Did you have another one yet?
No, not really. I mean, it would have been nice to have seen the reaction of the kid and the prosecutor, the defense and such. But then again, no, it wasn't.
No, I think that would have undercut the point of the film. I think the film was about the jury, and that would have made too much personality, whereas, especially in the play, there's a point to it only existing in the jury room. So,
and the other one was, did Lee Cobb try to reconcile with his son after this?
Yeah, that's an interesting open-ended question. I wonder how much this actually had in breaking him, or whether he was able to let go of some of his anger. I think the son is probably more angry than he is. And I think that's part of the reason there's the hang-up, because, they haven't spoken in 2 years and whatever else. I mean, it gets a lot for father. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that, because I know there are a lot of really bad relationships between fathers and sons, but it takes a lot for you and I to come to some level of physicality. So I don't think it came in a light portion of things. There's clearly some other substance behind that caused the rift in the first place, and I don't think with how proud they are that it would be easily rectified. But it is a curiosity. I only had one question, and it seemed like a throwaway line. I've never thought about this. I don't remember this ever being a part of the movie, but for whatever reason, again, maybe it's this new eye I've been watching things through. But so Jack Warden's character, Juror 7, mentions that he sold $27,000 worth of marmalade the year before. Or he made $27,000 on selling marmalade the year before. So I went and did an inflation calculation. Do you know how much that would be in current dollars?
About $250,000.
Yeah, it's like $248 or a little over $248,000. How the hell do you make that much money selling marmalade?
Have you ever had some good marmalade?
No, but nobody doing that.
I don't know.
It seems completely irrational. Like, he could have been an office supplies salesman, and I would have believed him more than this. Like, I don't know, other than maybe...
Working for Dunder Mifflin?
Dunder Mifflin. Anyway, the only type of person that I could think of as a quote-unquote salesperson would be like somebody that goes by the title financial analyst or advisor that would be able to make $250,000 selling anything. Maybe an insurance salesman, real estate guy. Those are like, I don't know how he made that much money selling marmalade. That's unfathomable. All right, so we'll get here to the last part of our show. We talked about doing the in memoriam. We lost a few people this week, so did you have those people to highlight and appreciate?
Yes. Number one, Cicely Tyson. Brilliant actress. Just class individual. I didn't realize until I was reading her biography that she was married to Miles Davis for about 7 or 8 years. But she was the epitome of class because she just refused to take parts that diminished women and diminished African American women. The last film she did was one that we kind of deadpanned, was The Help.
Mm-hmm.
But she, I remember watching her in the movie Roots, Miss Jane Pittman, the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, playing a woman who had been a slave and had been a member of the Underground Railroad and such. It was a classic piece of film. It was, I think it may have been more made for TV at the time than for the theaters, but just a very class act. Beautiful woman. Sorry we lost her. Actually, we lost him, the next actor, a few weeks ago, but he made it as part of his will that he was not to, the announcement of his death was not to be done until after he was interned because he didn't want paparazzi around. He just wanted his family there. That's Hal Holbrook. Hal's more recognized for his television and stage work than his movies, but still playing in All the President's Men, playing the villain in the second Dirty Harry film, doing a lot of different work through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. A very brilliant individual. Christopher Plummer, who just seemed to get better with age. Just a wonderful actor. And his last film was Knives Out, where he was brilliant in it. If not for Daniel Craig, I think he easily stole the movie when he was in it. And he's just was such a consummate actor as he aged and playing those parts. Just brilliant. I'm sorry that one of the regrets I have is that we happened to see Christopher Plummer with Brian Dennehy on Broadway when we were in New York and doing Inherit the Wind. So it's not often that you get to say that you saw somebody live performing. We got to meet Brian Dennehy afterwards at the stage door. Christopher Plummer was doing an interview, so he didn't come out. So that's a regret. I would have liked to have met him. From what I understand, he was always a gracious and very kind soul to his fans and the people around him. So we'll miss each of these three for various reasons. They all had, I think they were all three in their 90s.
Christopher Plummer, I believe, was 91. Holbrook, I believe, was 95. And I can't remember Cicely Tyson, but I believe you're right.
I think she just was like 90. So they had long lives and were fairly active right up until their deaths. And maybe to some extent the reason they were able to live and to be influential into their 90s is because of the fact that they never completely retired. They just kept working and doing things they loved doing.
Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else, just us and the microphones and those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week we will be doing Whiplash, the first feature film by Damien Chazelle starring Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons. And currently either on Starz, if you have it, or more likely Amazon Prime for all of you. So, you won't want to miss that one. Please like, subscribe, review, or whatever on whatever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram at @gmotepodcast. Or you can visit our website, which will be included in the show notes, and subscribe at the bottom of the site if you'd like to be a part of our newsletter. It has now been re-upgraded, and you can find everything there to do with the show so far. So, The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Anchor FM.